Hello, everyone, and happy today. I'm excited to begin looking at a new unit with you guys. Unit 4 looks at cellular communication and how cells can interact with one another to behave in a coordinated response. A lot of times this is new for people, so this is sort of exciting stuff because we sort of get a basic idea of how cells operate and make proteins and run themselves. But now we're looking into how do cells work in coordination with one another to help a broader organ and organism. So this is a really cool application of some of the ideas we've previously learned. So this notion of cells communicating with one another began with bacteria. So the first forms of prokaryotic life were these single-celled organisms like bacteria, and while a bacterium is an individual organism, it works in conjunction with other bacteria in order to sort of carry out actions as a group and respond to changes in the environment. So bacteria do this through chemical interactions. So you saw the really good Bonnie Bassler TED Talk looking at bacteria and how they coordinate with one another. So there in the bottom right, you see the squid with the bacteria that can produce this sort of glow reaction during certain times of the day because of the coordinated activity of bacteria. Now, this communication between bacteria, again, it's referred to as quorum sensing. And what bacteria can do is release a chemical out into the environment to detect the presence of other bacteria. So they don't turn on the genes and therefore proteins associated with a certain behavior until they know their population count is at a certain number. So bacteria can sort of sense the concentration of chemicals secreted by other bacteria. And at a certain point, that switches on genes that produce different proteins that allow bacteria to respond. So I thought it was really cool how she discussed the sort of the virulence attack of bacteria and how if you have a really small number of bacteria in an organism, a host organism, the bacteria may not sort of try to attack or launch their virulence attack until their numbers become sufficient. So that is in part why there may be this sort of incubation period for illnesses when a person consumes bacteria or is infected with the virus, where the body may not be under like an attack from the pathogen until they've reached sufficient number to cause illness. So being able to understand this sort of chemical interaction between bacteria allows us to maybe intervene in their communication and disrupt their communication and therefore virulence attack. Additionally, sort of understanding notionally the idea that cells communicate with one another through chemicals, it allows us to see what sort of communication systems there are in our bodies and how understanding those communication systems gives us an opportunity to sort of, again, fix issues. So one example of cellular communication happens during embryological development. So we all start off as a single cell, and that cell splits into 2 cells and 4 and 8 and 16, 32 on up. But eventually what happens is you create a hollow ball of cells called a blastula, and then that ball of cells folds in sort of like a C shape. That's called gastrulation. You create a gastrula, and then you basically have this, it's like a beach ball with a hole poked through the center of it, and that will develop into the tissues of our body. How do you go from this ball of cells into you? It's going to take some coordinated action from cells, right? And one example of this is the use of morphogens. Morph means form. So morphogens are chemicals that are secreted in the developing embryo, and due to the concentration gradient of those morphogens, it causes cells in different regions of the developing embryo to develop in different ways. So this is sort of a nice image that you see here. Here you have the cells or the embryonic tissue that's secreting those chemicals, and as the concentration gradient dissipates, it will cause the activation of different genes, which causes different proteins to be made, and then the cells and ultimately tissues develop in different ways. So really stuff like concentration gradients, oh my gosh, it matters so much in the development of you as an individual. And switching different genes on or off causes different proteins to be made, and cells and therefore tissues do different jobs. It all relies on this basic stuff that we've been learning. Okay, here is an interesting example of cellular communication between organisms. And this is actually related to a lab that you guys are going to do related to yeast mating. So with Saccharomyces cerevisiae, it's like the yeast, it's brewer's yeast. Use it for making bread and beer. There are two different strains or types of yeast that may be produced. One type of strain is called A-type yeast, and the other is an alpha-type yeast. And these yeast cells produce molecules that are called mating factors. So alpha yeast produce the alpha mating factor, A-type yeast produce the A factor. Now, cells of a certain strain have receptors for the opposite type of strain. So A cells, they produce this A factor, but they have receptors for the alpha factor, the other strain. And what's really cool is that when yeasts are around each other, they'll secrete their mating factors. And when they detect the presence of the opposite mating factor, they actually rearrange their cytoskeletons and grow toward one another and fuse their membranes. So it's a form of reproduction in yeast because they're able to detect these chemicals in the environment, switch on different enzymes, and then actually grow toward one another until they can fuse their membranes and reproduce. So this is a type of signaling between organisms. All right, so if we break down signaling, it can sort of be categorized in different ways. The signaling of the communication that occurs within and between cells happens through chemicals. There are all sorts of molecules that are created, and then those molecules can dock on different receptors in different types of cells and cause or elicit different responses. Now, one type of communication is called local signaling, and that can happen in different ways. One example of this is cytoplasmic connections. So if the cytoplasm of adjacent cells are connected, then, again, you're able to distribute chemicals between those cells really rapidly, and that allows sort of coordinated response from those cells. We see that example in the plasmodesmata of plants. If you recall from earlier chapters, plasmodesmata are like little holes in cell walls between plant cells, and that allows for continuous cytoplasmic connection. Another example of local signaling is direct cell-to-cell communication. So this is when proteins on cells actually dock and interact with one another, and that is seen in the actions of our cells, the immune system. So we'll get into B cells and T cells and helper Ts and all that kind of stuff in a later chapter, but they communicate with one another through direct contact. Okay? So again, these are types of local signaling. We also see local signaling through the release of molecules that travel between cells. This happens in paracrine signaling. With paracrine signaling, cells can release chemical signals to surrounding tissues and get, say, like an inflammatory response and stuff like that in tissues of that area. An example that we'll look at more closely here is synaptic signaling. You have a presynaptic cell and a postsynaptic cell, and they communicate by a chemical that we refer to as neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters will dock on receptors on the postsynaptic cell and then cause that to produce an electrical change in the cell that acts as sort of like the rapid communication of our nervous system. We'll get into nervous system later on in this unit. Now, long-distance signaling happens through the use of hormones. Hormones are chemical messages, right? So here we can see if we look at ethylene, this is a lipid-based or a lipid hormone. And what happens is these hormones can travel through organisms, or in the case of plants, between tissues to cause changes to occur. So sort of the hallmark of hormonal signaling in humans is that you have a secreting cell. So this could be glandular tissue, and it secretes a hormone into your bloodstream. And then those hormones circulate throughout the body. And then target cells will have receptors for those specific hormones. And then those target cells get the message and respond in certain ways. So your pituitary gland will release all sorts of different hormones around the body, but only cells that have receptors for that hormone respond to the target or respond to the chemical message. Another example of signaling between organisms is pheromones. Pheromones can be released by one organism, dock on receptors for another organism, and then communicate something between organisms. These moths are an interesting example. They can release mating factors into the air that can travel for miles and dock on receptors of moths of the same species, and then they can move toward the concentration gradient and find one another over long distances. I would also like to watch this quick clip with E.O. Wilson. He's amazing. This is an old guy. He's been around for decades, and he's still out going and exploring the world and learning about insects all over the world. So he's pretty remarkable.
You are watching a Nova Video Podcast.
Sorry for the video quality on this.
What I'm doing in this experiment out here in the field with a fire ant colony is putting baits on a blank piece of paper, one next to the colony itself, and then another bait at the end of our little platform of paper, a little distance from the nest, so the ants can't find it right away. What I'm doing here is holding a fire ant that I've just taken out of the nest, and I'm going to squeeze the rear end of the abdomen where the sting is that contains the trail substance that the ants use to lay down on the ground and guide other fire ants to food and new places for nesting. And I'm going to duplicate this by just taking out some of that material from the rear end of the ant, and then I'm going to lay my own trail and talk to the ants to lead them where I want them to go. And getting to work, and yes, it's going to work. And now, just a few minutes later, after I laid my trail, the ants themselves are laying their trail on top of that, and the result is a very strong trail, and quite a few ants now are going back and forth, and they'll do that for hours until they collect all that food. Examples besides the trail substance include alarm. They can signal one another that there's danger, and some ants can even signal what the danger is, which kind of an enemy it is. There are signals that tell other ants about a new nest site, where this is not such a hot dig, so we'll go somewhere else. And then there are signals that indicate what caste you belong to, like, hey, I'm a queen. Take care of me. I lay the eggs around here. And gradually, with chemists and biologists working together, we've worked out this vocabulary. In the case of fire ants, we found that they talk with between 10 and 20 of these signals. My favorite find was how ants tell that a fellow ant is dead. It's not enough for the ant to be lying still with his legs sticking up in the air. It has to have a certain decomposition substance that it only gets after a couple of days. That turns out to be oleic acid. Well, you can put oleic acid on a perfectly healthy ant, and the other ants will take it out and dump it in the refuse pile. And it stays there until it cleans itself off and then rejoins the living. This study of ants has shed a lot of light on how animals generally communicate by chemicals, and we now know that most kinds of animals do most of their communication with pheromones, talking with the use of chemicals that they taste and smell.
Okay. I find that really fascinating because we sort of, I think of communication as being something that's based in language or visual representations. But for most organisms, their communication happens between chemicals. So that's an important thing to consider. This interaction between signaling molecule and receptor is critical to functioning of organisms. And within us, we've got trillions of cells. They have to be able to interact with one another, and they do that through chemicals. So in the remaining segments, we're going to get into the types of signaling that occur. Okay. Now, with everything we talk about, there are certain basic features of all types of chemical signaling. So this is something to sort of take in as, all right, this is the basis for how this stuff works. There is the first step, which is reception. With reception, some ligand or signaling molecule docks on a receptor, and then that receptor changes its shape. And when the receptor changes its shape, it relays the signal inside the cell. Now, once inside the cell, there are other molecules in place that transduce or convert this signal into another form. So transduction is sort of the second major progression in this communication pathway. So you have molecules inside the cell that will interact with one another, cause shape changes, and then carry on that signal until you reach some sort of response. The cell does something. Now, what can a cell do? It can switch enzymes on or off. So again, think about being able to change the shape of enzymes. If you have an enzyme in one shape, it's switched off. If you change its shape to something else, it's switched on and active. So you can change enzymatic activity. Genes can be switched on or off. One thing that's sort of weird is throughout every day, you are literally having genes switched on and off inside of some of your cells. So you're switching genes on and off all the time so that proteins are being produced or they're not being produced. So in terms of like what you do, your body is an open system. There's stuff coming in from the external environment and there's stuff you're releasing to the environment. And what we do every day, what we expose ourselves to actually changes the activity of genes in our cells. So literally what you do changes who you are by switching genes on or off and having certain proteins being produced. And then cells do something. So again, genes are getting switched on and off, proteins are getting made or not, enzymes are being switched on or off, and you can even have cytoskeletal changes where cells rearrange their cytoskeletons and literally change their shapes. All right, so that's our introduction. We'll come up in the subsequent videos with some specifics, but I hope you're off and running here. This is really cool stuff. So thanks for participating in this.